Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 101 Criminal Law Online. Tonight's lecture is going to be on Chapter 11, and we are going to cover homicides. And we'll look at all the different aspects related to homicide. I'm also going to post another PowerPoint in this particular weekly module that's going to be more of an overview of a detective's job as it relates to homicide. And you can take a look at that too and kind of go through it at your own leisure, or I might even narrate it. But just to let you know, I am gonna put that in there because it would be appropriate for us to not only know a little bit about homicides, but also how does law enforcement approach these different things and these things that are deemed to be homicide. So to start off with, let's kind of look at the definition of homicide, and that's probably the best way to get into this chapter. The term homicide describes the killing of a human being or viable fetus by another human being. The killing may be either justifiable or excusable, in which case it is not unlawful, or it may in fact be felonious, in which event it is now a crime. The word homicide is used to describe all taking of human life by human act or agency, whether lawfully or unlawfully. So kind of to review what I just said, the killing of a human being or viable fetus by another human being. Homicide can be unlawful, like murder or manslaughter, or it may be lawful, meaning it may be excusable or justifiable homicide. Now, you can see the word murder is put in there and manslaughter, and the reason is because we tend to mix up homicide with murder. We kind of always say murder, and we never really say homicide. Homicide, again, is the word that describes the killing of a human being or viable fetus by another human being. And the word homicide is used, remember, to describe all taking of human life by human act or agency, whether lawful or unlawful. And underneath the umbrella of homicide, you will find things like murder or manslaughter. And we'll talk a little bit about those things a little bit later. Now, the act need not be the only cause of death, but it must be what they call the proximate cause of death. And we'll look at what proximate cause means in just a few minutes. And another unique thing about homicide is that the death must occur within 3 years and 1 day after the cause of death is administered to be presumed to have been the result of death. So in order for something to be declared a homicide, that person must pass away, okay, within that 3 year and 1 day time frame, or the death is going to be ruled the result of something different. So an unlawful homicide must be either the result of an affirmative act, an omission to act, meaning like not acting, or criminal negligence. And although the act need not be the only cause of death, again, it must be the proximate or direct cause. And we already kind of mentioned the fact that the death must occur within 3 years and 1 day after the cause of death is administered, or it will be rebuttably presumed that the death did not result from that particular act. And it's under Penal Code 194 if you're trying to figure out kind of where that is. So now we're back to this word corpus delicti, and we talked about it before in a previous chapter, but now we're going to look at it as it relates to homicide. Now, the term corpus delicti, meaning body of the crime, is the essential elements of an offense and does not necessarily refer to the body of a deceased person in a homicide case. And we tend to to kind of always think that. And this is especially true in California, since actually producing a dead body in a criminal homicide case is not an essential element of the crime of murder or manslaughter. Now, the corpus delicti of felonious criminal homicide consists of two different elements. And the first is death of a human being and an unlawful act, omission, or criminal agency causing such death. And I just kind of went over the fact that in California, producing a body is not an essential element of murder or manslaughter. And to go a little bit further, criminal homicide cases may be proven by a couple of different types of evidence. It could be direct evidence or by circumstantial evidence. So it's not necessary that there be direct evidence as to the means used to accomplish the killing in attempting to prove the corpus delicti of homicide. Such may be proven by circumstantial evidence only. And now we're going to take a quick look at this thing called proximate cause. And well, you know what? Before we jump to proximate cause, let me throw one other thing in there, because I kind of tend to do that after that corpus delicti portion we talked about, and that's going to be proof of death. And I want to make sure that we have a good handle on it. So, since in California both death and the criminal agency act causing death may be proven by circumstantial evidence, a physical body need not be produced, which means you don't have to have the dead person. Evidence may be based on eyewitnesses, parts of the body, or otherwise circumstantially. The fact that a person is merely missing is not sufficient evidence to support a prima facie case, or on its face case of homicide, but it should also be noted that one cannot be convicted on a confession alone as well. So a couple of different factors. So first, you don't need the body. We've already talked about that. But we need to know that if somebody's missing for a period of time, that in itself is not enough to make that prima facie case for homicide. And also, somebody can't be convicted for homicide just based on that confession alone. Now, circumstantial evidence supported a first-degree murder conviction of a wife whose husband died as a result of chronic arsenic poisoning over a 4-month period, and that's the case of People versus Hellwinkle, and it's a California case. But a little bit more importantly, what I want you to get from this is the issue of the body and how we can actually bring a case to trial without the deceased person. So there's a really cool video, and I may have even posted it, I just can't recall, as part of the introduction to this course in the weekly module. But if I didn't, go to YouTube and go to type in Forensics Files Season 9, Episode 4, No Corpus Delicti, and it's about a 24 to 25 minute video on a really cool case that talks directly to the issue of not having a body and that issue surrounding corpus delicti. So go there, watch that video. If I didn't post it, I think I did, but if I didn't, that'd be a great way to add some extra context to what we're talking about. So now back to kind of where we were. And we had heard that phrase proximate cause a couple minutes ago, so it's better to kind of add a little bit more definition to it. So the cause of death must be directly, closely, and immediately related to the assailant's criminal act or omission. If there is any type of intervening act not a result of the defendant's act, then the defendant is not responsible for that homicide. Now, one interesting note too, as we kind of go through some of this information, we can see that mercy killings, or kind of what they call euthanasia, may be murder if the defendant acts with some type of malice. But remember, just for proximate cause, the cause of death must be directly, closely, and immediately related to the suspect's criminal act or omission. So that's what proximate cause means. So now let's move on to what is murder. And you know, we know what homicide is. We know homicide is more of that kind of big umbrella that we're talking about. So now let's break it down a little bit further and talk about things like murder and manslaughter and degrees of murder and things. So murder can be found under Penal Code Section 187, subsection A, and is defined as the unlawful killing of a human being or fetus with malice aforethought. And we'll talk about what malice is in a minute. Now, this murder section, shall not apply to the death of a fetus under law where it is done within a medically approved manner under Health and Safety Code 25950. Now, malice, however, is defined for murder purposes under Penal Code Section 188, and there are two types of malice. Because remember, we just read this phrase here for murder, malice aforethought. So now we're going to look at what malice is. We're going to look at Penal Code Section 188, and we're going to look at these two different types of malice. And one is going to be, as it indicated, express, and the other is going to be implied. So as stated in Penal Code Section 188, malice is express when there is manifested a deliberate intention unlawfully to take away the life of a fellow creature. Okay? Express malice must always be present in first-degree murder. It is considered to be present where the evidence shows a deliberate intention unlawfully to take the life of another human being, such as where one kills another with a deliberate and formed design. So express malice, to shorten up that definition, the deliberate intention to take the life of a fellow creature, example, human being, not a dog or a cat, a human being, and must always be present in first-degree murder. And the fact that we see that there's a first-degree murder means that there's going to be a second degree, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now, implied malice, as stated in Penal Code Section 188, malice is implied when no considerable provocation appears, or when the circumstances attending the killing show an abandoned or malignant heart. Implied malice has been defined as that which arises or may be inferred from the intentional doing of an unlawful or wrongful act with a wrongful purpose. Implied malice exists where the killing was done suddenly without justification or excuse, and without provocation, or without provocation sufficient to reduce the homicide to manslaughter. So what's a simpler way of saying implied malice? The killing shows an abandoned and a malignant heart. This means a wanton or conscious disregard for human life. And an example could be driving recklessly at dangerously high speeds near a school and killing a child. That would be implied. Now, that term malice aforethought, so we read about that under the section, under that murder section, that 187 section. So this term comes from the Old Common Law, and it means the requisite mental state for murder encompassing an intent to kill. And this intent includes three different things: the intent to inflict great bodily injury, reckless indifference to human life, and intent to commit a felony. And we'll talk about the felony murder rule in just a few minutes. So malice aforethought is not limited to a simple intent to kill. It can also mean a purpose or design that leads to the unlawful killing of another. And a couple of slides from now, we'll get to the felony murder rule, and we'll kind of clean that up for you so you understand it a little bit better. So before we get there, let's talk about degrees of murder. So we know that by what we saw a couple of minutes ago, there's going to be more than one. Well, actually, there's 2 degrees of murder. So Penal Code 189 states that there are two degrees for the crime of murder. There's first degree and second degree. Now, first degree would be all murder perpetrated or carried out by the following: means of destructive device, explosive, weapons of mass destruction, armor-piercing bullets, poison, torture, lying in wait, meaning like waiting for somebody to perhaps cross your path or come home or something like that, those lying in wait type crimes, or any other willful, premeditated, meaning like you thought about it, and deliberate killing, or committed in perpetration or the attempt to perpetrate certain serious felony crimes. And that's going to be under the felony murder rule, and we're going to get there again, I promise, in just a second. Now, that's first degree. All other murder is considered second degree. So that should really make it pretty simple for you to figure out. So now we're there. We're at this thing called the felony murder rule. So what is that? What is the felony murder rule? Well, if a death occurs during the perpetration or carrying out or attempt of one of the following serious felonies, kind of like we read in the slide just a second ago, it's first degree murder. So if death occurs during the carrying out or attempt of one of these following crimes, it's considered first degree. So burglary, arson, rape, robbery or carjacking, mayhem, kidnapping, train wrecking, yes, I know, it's different, certain sex crimes, and drive-by shooting. So if murder occurs in any of these types of crimes during the commission, if you will, of any of these crimes, okay, it is going to automatically be first degree murder. So some important terms, and we've seen a couple already. We saw lying in wait, and we know that that's waiting and watching for something to occur with the intention of inflicting bodily injury on another, kind of like an ambush. So a couple of other terms: premeditation, to think about and resolve in the mind beforehand, that conscious consideration. So when they talk about premeditated murder, that means that we thought about it beforehand and we had that conscious consideration. Now, deliberation means deciding after some thought and weighing the options, fully considering whatever those options might be. So now that we know what murder is and we know the different types of malice and things like that, well, what would be the penalty for murder? Well, the penalty for first degree murder can be a couple of different things. It could be death. It could be life in prison without parole. It could be state prison time of 25 years to life. Now, the penalty for second degree murder is state prison time of 15 years to life. First degree murder with special circumstances would be the death penalty, which may include a couple of the things that are listed down below that qualify as special circumstances. So intentional murder carried out for financial gain, using an explosive or destructive device. The victim is a law enforcement officer or firefighter. The victim is a witness, prosecutor, judge, or public official, or the victim is intentionally killed based on race, color, religion, some type of hate crime or something like that. So all of those first degree murder cases with special circumstances would be the death penalty, providing the victims were one of the individuals listed below. So again, we know that because we're studying criminal law, there are code sections for everything. So if you want to know a little bit more about penalties, you can actually look them up. So if you want to know the penalty for murder for first degree, like we just talked about, it's Penal Code Section 190A. Same with second degree, killing of a police officer. If you want to know the penalty for drive-by shooting, or first degree murder with special circumstances, or death penalty where the suspect might be under 18, or second degree murder, all of these things are listed in the code sections, and I believe they start on page 177 and go through page 179 in your textbook, so you can kind of look those up and figure out what the penalty is for whatever it is that you're looking for. Now, keep in mind when we're talking about penalties, a lot of times there are enhancements that come with a lot of these penalties that may not actually be built into the penalty. So murder with, let's say, a knife, you're going to get the conviction for murder and you'll get the penalty, whatever that is. But if you use a firearm, there's going to be an enhancement that's going to be on top of whatever that first number of years or whatever that penalty is. Does that make sense? So there are enhancements. If it's a gang crime, there could be an enhancement that goes along with that section as well. So just keep in mind that the penalties might actually come with some type of enhancement. So we talked about proximate cause, but let's add in the felony murder rule here and talk about proximate cause. So each conspirator is liable for a murder committed by any of them when, first, the killing is done during the commission of a serious felony in furtherance of the criminal conspiracy. In a case where all had agreed to kill. And for surviving accomplices when their conduct was the proximate cause of a lethal response by the victim or police, resulting in the death of one or more accomplices. So that felony murder rule, that proximate cause, can actually attach to one of the suspects, an accomplice, if, again, the conduct was the proximate cause of a lethal response by the victim or police, resulting in the death of one of your partners, one of your accomplices. So kind of an interesting thing. So now that we've kind of gone over homicide and we've gone over murder, let's address another area that falls under the homicide umbrella, and that's manslaughter. Now, manslaughter is the unlawful killing of a human being without malice. So remember murder? If we go back to the definition of murder, if you remember exactly what it is, murder is the unlawful killing of a human being or fetus with what? Malice aforethought. And we know what aforethought means, and we know what malice means. Well, now, manslaughter is the unlawful killing of a human being without malice. Okay? And there are three kinds of manslaughter, basically, and you can find these under section, the Penal Code Section 192. And the first is voluntary, the second is involuntary, and the third is vehicular. Now, the vehicular one is going to be easy for you to figure out, but what's this voluntary thing and an involuntary thing? Well, first let's look at the difference between murder and manslaughter. So the distinction between murder and manslaughter is that murder requires malice and manslaughter does not. So that should help a little bit. But now let's look at this voluntary manslaughter thing. So under section 192A of the Penal Code, voluntary manslaughter is committed when a person intentionally and unlawfully kills another by sudden quarrel or heat of passion. So maybe someone comes home and finds a spouse has been cheating on them and they have this sudden quarrel or heat of passion and a death occurs as a result of it. So this might be where that could fall under this voluntary manslaughter section. Now, it may also be committed when a person kills unintentionally in a sudden quarrel or heat of passion, where the person acts with what they call conscious disregard for life, or when a person kills another in an unreasonable belief in having to act in self-defense, and it's called imperfect self-defense. So heat of passion, because we need to know what that is, because we kind of know what sudden quarrel is, but if we go back up right here, we need to know what this means. What does heat of passion mean? Well, it tells us, which is really good. Heat of passion means anger, resentment, fear, jealousy, etc. The type of passion that would be aroused in the minds of the ordinary, reasonable person. And that's part of voluntary manslaughter. Now, there's a couple other parts that are really important when we talk about voluntary manslaughter. And these are called adequate provocation and cooling time. So under adequate provocation, it must be determined by viewing how the ordinary reasonable person under the same circumstances would have viewed it. So when we look at heat of passion, if we go back here just for a second and we look at, voluntary manslaughter is committed when another person intentionally and unlawfully kills another, sudden quarrel, heat of passion. Well, if we go forward now, we're going to use this adequate provocation. So the courts are going to really look at this, and it must be determined by viewing how the ordinary reasonable person under the same set of circumstances would have viewed it. And then there's this thing called cooling off time. So if a person has had time to, quote, cool off, end quote, and then commits a killing, it can be charged as murder. The time to cool off is kind of based again, and you've seen this in a lot of different things we've talked about, that reasonableness, and here they call it the reasonable man theory. And so basically, if there's an argument and it's getting very heated or whatever, and you leave and you have time to think about it and cool off, and then you come back and you kill someone, you can't use that voluntary manslaughter, that heat of passion thing, because you've had that cooling off time. And hopefully that kind of makes sense to you. So that's the voluntary. Now, what about involuntary? Well, section 192, subsection B, tells us involuntary manslaughter is the unlawful killing of a human being without malice under the following conditions. So these things have to be there. In commission of an unlawful act, not a felony. And you could probably think of what that might be. Or in commission of a lawful act, which may produce death in an unlawful manner if done without due caution and circumspection. So again, involuntary manslaughter, the unlawful killing of a human being without malice under a couple of conditions. The first one would be in commission of an unlawful act, not a felony, and the next would be in commission of a lawful act, which may produce death in an unlawful manner if done without due caution and circumspection. Well, then that leaves us with vehicular, and I think this is kind of the easiest one because it talks about vehicle or vehicular, so we know that this is going to kind of deal with a car or something to do with vehicles. So section 192C1 starts us off talking about vehicular manslaughter. So driving a vehicle during an unlawful act, not a felony, with gross negligence, or commission of a lawful act which might produce death done in an unlawful manner with gross negligence. Now, I know this is tough to understand, but I've got a really cool chart I'm going to show you in a minute that's going to help you get through this. The second one, section C2, driving a vehicle during an unlawful act, not a felony, without gross negligence or commission of a lawful act which might produce death, done in an unlawful manner without gross negligence. C3, driving in violation of California Vehicle Code Section 23140 or 23152, which is DUI, 23153, under the influence, with or without injury, in commission of an unlawful act, not a felony, and with gross negligence, or done in commission of a lawful act, which might produce death, done in an unlawful manner without gross negligence. Oh my God, there's just so many technical terms. And C4, driving and causing an accident for the purpose of insurance fraud, and someone, of course, gets killed. So this is where vehicular manslaughter kind of sets in. So maybe some examples might kind of help us here to understand what it is. So let me give you some vehicular manslaughter examples. Driving at an excessive speed and hitting a person standing by the roadway near a parked car is manslaughter in the driving of a motor vehicle with gross negligence if death occurs. Another one, failure to stop at a traffic signal, all conditions being normal, which results in the death to the other driver, was sufficient to sustain a conviction for manslaughter for grossly negligent operation of an automobile. And one more, death which results in a driver being blinded by approaching lights of another vehicle, and where the driver, as a result of his visibility being impaired, strikes and kills a pedestrian in a crosswalk, is manslaughter in the driving of a vehicle without gross negligence. Now, I know it's tough to kind of get through all those, and there are a lot of sections in there for you to look at. And if you look at, if you're in chapter 11, you look at page 182, it does break down again all of those different manslaughter sections here that we're kind of going over. So I know, again, it's kind of tough, but you'll get through it. So what are the punishments? Well, section 193 tells us both voluntary and involuntary manslaughter are felonies punishable by imprisonment in the state prison. Now, voluntary manslaughter is punishable by imprisonment in the state prison for 3, 6, or 11 years. Involuntary manslaughter is punishable by imprisonment in the state prison for 2, 3, or 4 years. And vehicular manslaughter is punishable either by imprisonment in the county jail for not more than 1 year, or by imprisonment in the state prison for 2, 4, 6, or 10 years. It really depends on the severity of what took place and some other circumstances that might have been there. Now, for vehicular manslaughter, to be deemed vehicular manslaughter, the homicide must be the proximate result of the unlawful act or of the lawful act which might produce death committed in an unlawful manner. It is ultimately up to the trier of fact, the judge or the jury, to determine if an act was done with or without gross negligence. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what about those other things that kind of come into play? And we heard those. Well, maybe you're doing something in the line of duty or whatever. So are there any times that homicide can be okay? Meaning that you won't be charged and put in prison or something like that. So let's look at excusable homicide. Now, homicide is excusable in the following cases. When committed by accident and misfortune, so if it's just strictly an accident, or doing any other lawful act by lawful means with usual and ordinary caution and without any unlawful intent. So pretty much an accident. Or when committed by accident and misfortune in the heat of passion, upon any sudden and sufficient provocation, or upon sudden combat, when no undue advantage is taken nor any dangerous weapon is used, and when the killing is done not in a cruel and unusual manner. So how about two people fighting through like sudden combat or quarrel, and somebody ends up dying? So, I mean, that could be something that actually could fall under the section of excusable. And then there's another section called justifiable. And typically it's by public officers. So homicide is justifiable when committed by public officers and those acting by their command in their aid and assistance, either one, in obedience to any judgment of a competent court, meaning like if somebody is sentenced to death, that would be a judgment of a competent court. So it's still a homicide because somebody is still going to die in there, but it's justifiable in obedience to any judgment of a competent court, or when necessarily committed in overcoming actual resistance to the execution of some legal process or in the discharge of any other legal duty, like an officer trying to discharge their duties and maybe somebody fires upon them and they return fire or what have you, or when necessarily committed in retaking felons who have been rescued or have escaped, or when necessarily committed in arresting persons charged with a felony and who are fleeing from justice or resisting such arrest. And you can look at all of these under Penal Code Section 196. Now, justifiable homicide by maybe other persons, is there something that actually can be there? Well, yes. So justifiable homicide by a private person can be found under Penal Code Section 197. Justifiable homicide in protecting one's home can be found under Section 198.5. Self-defense can be under Penal Code Section 675, and there's a case, People versus Scroggins. And then just looking at justifiable and excusable homicide, again, if you want to look at those in more detail, they are under that particular section there. Well, let's finish up with just a couple of things, and we're going to talk about capital crimes. And after that, I'm going to show you kind of a really cool chart that's going to help you understand all of these things I've been talking about. I guarantee it. So capital crimes are typically those crimes where somebody may be sentenced to death if they are 18 years of age or older, if first-degree murder is committed under any of the following circumstances. So all of these listed here are considered to be capital crimes. So under capital crimes, again, a defendant may be sentenced to death if 18 years of age or older, if first-degree murder is committed under any of the following circumstances. And you can look at all the different sections there. And there's a whole bunch more here. So we're not going to go through each one of those. So now we're here to this really cool chart that I have. And this is going to kind of finish us up for this evening. So we talked about homicide, and then we talked about murder, right? I like that word, murder. Depending upon how you say it, it sounds kind of cool. And then we know there's two kinds of, or two levels of murder, right? There's first and second degree. And then we know that there's certain crimes that actually, fall under first degree and the ones that fall under second. And then for first degree, there needs to be the express malice, and for second, there's implied. And then we know that we also went over some sections that were where homicide was lawful, which was justifiable and excusable. And then we went a little bit further and we talked about the unlawful death or killing, which would fall under like voluntary manslaughter or involuntary, or when you're driving a car. So the chart before you really shows you where everything falls. So homicide, really, it's not a crime itself. It's more the descriptive piece of several different acts. It's the big umbrella. If you want to say it's a crime, fine, go ahead, but really it's kind of not. It's the descriptive part of the several acts. It's the big umbrella. So if you look up here, you can see homicide covers all of these acts. And if you look to the left here, you can see murder, okay? Unlawful, right? And we have here, we know that for felony murder here, there's two kinds of malice. For first degree, there has to be expressed. And for first degree, these crimes are going to be in first degree. So this should really help you out. For first degree murder, we know it's express malice. And down here it also tells us what it is. Manifested by a deliberate intent to take a life of another willfully. So, for first degree murder, you need express malice, and it's going to be one of these types of crimes for first degree that are going to make it first degree. All others are second degree, and second degree second degree murder has what kind of malice? It's got implied malice, and it includes all other felonies, not these, all other felonies. And we know, again, there's two types of malice because it tells us. And then down here, we also put the difference between first and second degree murder is malice. So that helps us with murder. Now let's move over here. We know that under homicide, there's lawful death, if you will, and unlawful death. Well, under lawful, we have justifiable homicide, which would be the judgment of a court officer performing their duties. Or excusable might be that accident or misfortune. Remember how we talked about that? And then the unlawful. So here's lawful and here's unlawful. Well, we have those voluntary and the involuntary. So in voluntary, without malice, sudden quarrel, intentional killing without provocation. And involuntary would be without malice, unlawful act causing death, unintentional killing. And then vehicular, we know, is driving a vehicle. Okay, unlawful act, not a felony, or a lawful act done in an unlawful manner without gross negligence. Now, if you go a little bit further, we've kind of even taken it a little bit further so you can see murder unlawful. So you get a close-up picture of that bigger chart that I showed you. And then a little bit more here, we separated it out where we've got the lawful and the unlawful. So I'm hoping that this really kind of helps you deal with homicide and kind of shows you what falls where. When you take some of your quizzes, you're going to see some questions that are going to ask you about murder. And you're going to see some things, some examples of maybe what might be justifiable homicide or excusable homicide, or a scenario question, and you're going to have to figure out which type of manslaughter it might be. The good part is that you can use this chart. They have this chart, I believe, at the end of chapter 11 in your textbook, and we've also built this chart into the lecture so you can use that as well. So I'm hoping, again, that really helps you out in distinguishing the different types of things that fall under the big umbrella of homicide. With that being said, that's going to end our discussion, our lecture, if you will, on homicides on chapter 11. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them on the discussion board. If you don't want to post them on the discussion board, you can send me an email, and that's just as good. With that being said, that's going to be it again for chapter 11. Until next time.